Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Shield and Shade, Ascended Guardian Series, Book 1 by Misty Hayes, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1, Zoe. I'd gotten lost when I was 5 years old. Just up and wandered out of our unlocked house during the night. A mistake my parents still blamed themselves for. But our household was a full one, and it could have been any of my older siblings who'd left the door open and unlocked. A mistake that haunted our family even to this day, 10 years later. There was a patch of wooded area within a mile of my house, not enough acreage to call it a forest, but big enough to call it home to coyotes, the occasional bobcat, deer, and snakes. And it was where I'd ended up. I shuddered, thinking about a 5-year-old drifting through the woods alone at night. No wonder I had nightmares. Those few days were a massive blank in my life, my lost time. I didn't remember anything except for the frightening visions that assaulted me in the middle of the night. Nighttime. The time when my bad dreams rose up unwanted and unbidden, like stomach acid in the throat to assault me. My heart would burn. My lungs would clog, and my mind would race. It happened often. Even when falling asleep with the light on, I tried sleep aids, playing white noise in the background, and deep breathing, falling asleep with earbuds in, listening to music, but nothing ever stopped the dark visions from creeping back in. They were always the same. I was trapped in a dark, cramped space, terrified and blind. I couldn't breathe. The air was too thin. There would be a flash of red like fur or hair or blood, and then sharp, feral teeth snapping, a wild animal attacking me, eyes flashing with eye shine, and I'd wake up panting and sweating, my own blankets smothering me, holding me hostage. Tonight was no different. I woke, sitting up ramrod straight in bed with a cold hand pressed to my forehead. Shh, 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 Zoe, I'm here. It was only a bad dream. You're okay. I blinked, my vision sliding in and out of focus, gulping in a lungful of air, willing myself to fully wake up out of the foggy haze, the last of the flashes passing across the backs of my eyelids. Dark eyes, red hair, sharp teeth. You were screaming again. My mother, she was sitting next to me. You're awake, Zoe. I could see her worried and strained face in the soft golden glow coming from my bedside table lamp. The creases around her eyes had deepened. She looked so much older and more fragile, and for a second I felt bad that I'd woken her up. And then her smile returned, and she was sitting back, her facial features softening. It was one of the only times I'd ever let her comfort me, when I was half out of my mind from the lingering after effects of a vivid nightmare. I was 15, too old for being coddled or tucked into bed, and yet I was still terrified of being left alone, to be sucked back into those chilling nightmares all over again. Taken, drifting into the scary black void, feeling helpless and afraid. How bad was it this time? My mom asked. Her voice was soft and low. You need anything? I shook my head as I raked a hand through my hair, sweeping it off my damp forehead. I'm okay, thanks. I felt the full weight of her concerned gaze on me. Do you want to talk about it? Was it the same nightmare? When she tried to slip her hand into mine, I pulled away, feigning an apologetic grimace. I just wanted to go to sleep. I wanted to forget about the debilitating fear and solitude. I didn't want her to psychoanalyze me. I didn't want anything from her. This was her fault. I thought I saw a flash of hurt cross her face as I tried to explain. It's just late. I'm going to try and get some sleep. It's nothing new. The same thing over and over again. A strange creature in a flash of red hair like fur. I'll be fine. And now that I'm awake, I know it's silly. It's nothing. Those words sounded hollow in my own ears. She didn't look quite convinced, and I could tell she wasn't going to drop it. After a second, she cast her eyes down and pressed her lips into two thin lines, seemingly thinking, if you do ever want to talk about it, about that night. I'm good. I let out an angry breath of air. That was all we'd ever done, talk about it. I don't want to talk about it anymore. And with that, I rolled over and left her sitting on the side of my bed. Chapter 2. Alistair. On most days, Alistair Isler found the forest an extremely calming place. Peaceful, serene, perfect. The birds above him would normally be chittering to one another as he sprinted by out on his morning run. The squirrels would already have been winding their way around tree limbs, acorns pelting down from above. Today, though, the woods felt ominous, too quiet. There were no animals or insects or even wind. A heavy fog clung to everything, a warped fairy tale. The entire land placed in a deep sleep like an enchantment, every living thing affected by it but him. This odd feeling was what gave Alistair pause. He couldn't see more than 10 feet in front of him in any direction. It was eerie, and the sun hadn't yet started to rise to burn the fog away. As soon as he'd raced to the crest of a steep hill, he halted, winded and perturbed, a nagging feeling hitting him right in the pit of his stomach. Foreboding. Something was wrong. Trail running was usually meditation for his soul, but not this morning. A niggling intuition at the back of his mind told him to be on guard. There was still a little over 10 kilometers left to go on this route, but now he was only thinking about turning around and going home. The top of his scalp prickled, a feeling he got when he was being watched. Alistair had learned to listen to his intuition after over 150 years' worth of fighting experience. He used to be a preternatural creature, a vampire, and he possessed over 20 different black belts in various martial arts to prove this skill. Alistair had a PhD in heightened awareness. He took in a few deep breaths, the smell of pine and earth strong in his nostrils, and then something else. Sulfur. Alistair had been around enough weird in his life to recognize that portentous feeling immediately. Someone could spin him around blindfolded and he'd still be able to find his way back home unassisted. After all, he'd been hiking and running these woods for the better part of 7 years. His cabin, well, technically the cabin belonged to his wife, Larna Isler, sat just 5 kilometers to the east of where he'd stopped. It was nestled in woodland bordering northeast London. The forest could be a peculiar place as well as a tranquil one. Nature was fickle. If you were cautious around her, she could wipe you off the face of the planet in one fell swoop. The mist thickened unnaturally before his very eyes, and his skin prickled again. Someone was definitely out there watching him. Things had been much simpler since he no longer retained the mantle of vampire, which was fine by him. Alistair's life was perfect without any world-ending crisis or supernatural bad guy to worry about. Like Gabriel Stanton. It had been 10 years since the battle at the Tree of Souls, an epic world-ending war between angels and vampires. It was a miracle he'd survived, and that was only because of his best friend and half-human, half-angel, Corinth Taylor. Nephilim, elite warrior. The Watchers, a team of angels and guardians who took care of anything preternatural or demonic that popped up on their radar. Alistair was retired. For him, there were no more threats. No more bad guys to worry about. No supernatural battles to fight, except that wasn't true. Not at all. He just didn't deal with it now. He'd gone about his life occasionally hearing stories about Corinth, Leo, and the rest of the Watchers over the years. Even Corinth had a day job, telecommuting professor for a college in Texas, so he could stay close to his family, but also pick up and travel whenever he needed to, which technically was the best cover to have for a part-time superhero gig. Larna Isler, formerly Collins, had graduated medical school, and shortly after that she'd gotten married to the luckiest man in the world, him. She was now a well-respected doctor in London, but she was on leave back home in Fort Worth, Texas, visiting her mother and father for their upcoming Thanksgiving holiday. He missed her already. Alistair had been trying to open his own deli and bakery in central London, and there had been a lot of unexpected hold-ups and red tape, which had delayed him from joining his wife right away. Actually, she was probably still sound asleep, he mused. The difference in time was 6 hours. While it was 6 a.m. in London, it was 12 a.m. in Texas. He regretted leaving the warmth of his bed and not being with his wife right at this very moment. She usually joined him on his early morning runs. They'd just celebrated their 7th wedding anniversary in Italy a few weeks ago. The topic of having kids had come up on more than one occasion. A branch broke close by, pulling Alistair fully out of his reverie, and an icy sensation settled between his shoulder blades. He jerked his head around, scanning the area, suddenly alert. It didn't help that he couldn't see anything past the dense haze, which had started to feel more and more like a swampy bog than England. Alistair knew he had felt something peculiar, a tug of sixth sense. His heartbeat quickened as he listened to his surroundings. A resounding crack sent some crows flying from their roosts overhead. He couldn't see them, but he could hear the beating of wings as they fled, their caws loud. It wasn't out of the norm to hear these kind of things in the woods. Dry, brittle branches broke all the time, whether it was caused by the wind or wildlife or just the passing of time. Except this felt different. He knew the sound of someone trying to conceal their own footsteps, and someone trying not to. The hairs at the nape of his neck stood up as stiff as wires. Cold air hit the back of his neck, and instinct told him to run. Alistair pretended to check his heart rate monitor on his smartwatch as he took in his surroundings. All he had to do was press one little button, and Corinth Taylor would show up instantly. The Nephilim could travel through lightning. A teleporting skill Alistair wished he now possessed. But he didn't want to cry wolf too early. He hadn't needed to call for backup in years. And the first sign of something paranormal wasn't going to change that fact. Besides, he could wait until the lurker revealed themselves to him at the very least. That way he would know what he was dealing with. Alistair still kept in close contact with Corinth, and he knew there hadn't been much activity of late, or if there was, Corinth hadn't shared it with him. Oh well, time to check in anyway, he decided. As Alistair started to press the emergency signal to alert Corinth and transmit his location, a deep boom broke through the quietude, sounding a lot like a cross between a gunshot and a cannon being fired. More startled birds flew from the roosts above him, squawking madly as they went. Something whizzed past his head, sharp and biting, and the next thing he knew his ears were ringing and he was rolling down the wrong side of the hill he'd just sprinted up, the side where there was no path, only trees, and a short drop-off to another path below that like a switchback. Dirt and dust billowed out behind Alistair as adrenaline tore through his veins, sharpening his focus. Several branches poked and scratched his face and neck. Bits of sharp rock impaled him. He clawed wildly at the dry leaves, trying to find purchase, and on his slide about halfway down the slope, a rope coiled around his wrist, and a hot, agonizing pain tore up his arm at the same time as he was jerked to an abrupt stop. Fire lanced through him like a lightning bolt, shocking his system into submission. Air left his lungs in a violent, ragged gasp. He couldn't see his attacker, only knew that they were standing above him at the top of the incline he'd just fallen down. Alistair craned his neck to see something coiled around his wrist, the same wrist his watch was attached to. He caught a glimpse of brown, braided leather. No, not a rope. A whip. Alistair let out a gurgled cry as he reached for the tiny red dot flashing on his watch like a beacon. The deep crack came again, sounding a lot more ominous this time. In the next instant, the cord uncoiled and tore the watch clean off his arm, and his last chance at calling for aid went soaring through the air out of sight. And because the whip was no longer holding him in place, he finished plummeting down the hill, backward, hitting rocky outcroppings and prickly brush on his way down, until his breath was knocked free of his lungs as he finally landed flat on his back with brutal force. Pain exploded through his body, immobilizing him. Vaguely, Alistair was aware that someone was coming. There was some movement off to his left, a sleek shadow darting toward him, but he could do nothing but wait for it to greet him. "Can't have you calling for help now, can we?" The voice sounded raspy and deep and odd, as if from disuse. "Move, Alistair. Move your ass." Out of the heavy fog strode a shadowy figure, a sharp outline of a body, as lithe and ethereal as a half-erased pencil sketch. Alistair blinked a few times, his senses scattered, trying to figure out what he was looking at right as his attacker hauled back on the whip again. Knowing he only had a fraction of a second to react, Alistair flipped himself back to his feet and lunged into the shadow thing, barreling into a half-solid body. A surprised grunt came from the creature, as if it hadn't expected Alistair to be so bold. The smoke spiraled up and around the shadow thing as it took on a more humanoid form. A strong smell of rotten eggs burned his nostrils. And then the thing materialized fully, taking on the shape of a man. At least Alistair thought it looked like a man. It was bald and had unnaturally polished onyx skin, and those eyes! Alistair shuddered. They were ink black like obsidian marbles, no white in them whatsoever. Thick, silvery veins snaked up its arms and the sides of its neck, looking a lot like liquid mercury. Alistair had never seen a creature like this before. He struck out several times in rapid succession, hitting the shadow thing in its abdomen, chest, and torso, and in the same fluid movement, he twisted around and attempted to land a roundhouse, except his foot connected with nothing. Only smoke as it sailed right through the thing, and he lost his footing. The creature, seeing an opening, rematerialized in front of Alistair, jerked its head back, and headbutted him across the bridge of his nose. Blood burst across Alistair's vision, blinding him and pouring down his throat. Alistair flew backward, rolling across a carpet of dead leaves and grime before fetching up against the side of a giant oak, stars shooting across his vision. Dirt and leaves ground into his back as he tried to move. Damn it, he'd gotten slow. And that thing was inhumanly strong. For a long drawn-out moment, he couldn't see or hear. He only felt the thudding of his blood slamming through his veins. Alistair wiped a hand down his face, trying to clear the salt out of his eyes. It stung. Alistair Isler, you can't fight us. Us? Alistair was brutally aware of the brown braided whip wrapped up in the shadow thing's grip. The notches and plates were interlaced with woven leather. Aged, cracked leather. He studied the weapon like someone might study a guillotine in startling detail right before being beheaded. Get up! Get up! Get up! Alistair stumbled to a knee, a hand going to his head as the oppressive fog turned into something dark and sinister, filling the forest, wrapping around his chest, almost choking him. It looked like night had suddenly fallen in the span of mere moments. There came a chill in the air, and his sweat crystallized on his skin. Now Alistair's tremor was caused by something else entirely. Fear. The thick black smoke seemed to have a mind of its own as it formed a wide circle around him, solidifying and evolving into a... Holy hell! A darkly clad army. Where was his watch? He cast a furtive glance around, licking his dry lips, assessing. The creatures all looked alike, like the monster standing in front of him. Same liquid metal marks in place of veins, tracking lines up and down their arms and necks. Same bald heads and ink-black skin, disturbingly ugly. And one horrifying word popped into Alistair's head. Demons.